Please welcome CEO of Africa Tourism Association, Naledi Kabo, and CEO of the Travel Foundation and Chair at Future of Tourism Coalition, Jeremy Sampson, in discussion with Skift Global Tourism reporter, Lebawit Lily Gurma.
So Naledi, it's so nice to have you here.
Thank you very much.
And Jeremy, welcome.
Hi.
Who's all the
Good
way
to be here.
Joining us all the way from the Austrian Alps. We're very jealous. So Naledi and Jeremy are here because they've both actually been working very hard and pushing the industry to look at how to build back better on the other side of the pandemic, what that means. And they're here to make all of us, or at least all of you and the industry, uncomfortable. And look at, some of the issues that travel tends to not to confront. But they're also here to present ideas, solutions, and actually some great news as well. So we're going to look at this through three issues. Climate action, which we've heard quite a bit about today, but this will be a lot more concrete, as well as diversifying the tourism chain and community. Those are the three issues we'll focus on, and they're also part of our underlying theme at the conference, which is unlearning travel's old habits. Are we just going to go back to the old status quo of counting traveler numbers and forgetting about the lessons of the pandemic? And if we don't, what does a systems change look like? So Naledi, let's kick off with diversifying the tourism chain. Through your work at the Africa Tourism Association, which is made up of destinations and private sector, how have you sought to really innovate the way that tourism is, operates through its chain, and what are the opportunities that are being missed?
Well, as an organization, we were forced to innovate during COVID, as many brands and organizations were. And for us, that innovation included, a level of digitization, strengthening relationships, and then identifying opportunities. So when we talk about diversifying the industry, it's diversifying how Africa is presented as a region. It's typically marketed as a safari destination, but there's so many more products across the continent. It's typically marketed to the US and European markets and white individuals, to be exact. And so why not tap into the diaspora, and what does that look like? First of all, it's a $109 billion business, so it just makes financial sense.
Right. So new markets or new customer.
It's new markets, it's new customers, it's new marketing strategies. It's also looking at the supply chain a little differently. In the trade, there's a lot of talk about buyers and suppliers. So even the way buyers are identified, there's a new buyer. There's new people making decisions in terms of how people are, traveling, looking at like these group travel influencers and group travel leaders. They're not in the supply chain right now. They're not being really engaged by destinations.
Sure. Can you name a few of those?
For example, like Nomadness Travel Tribe is one, Black and Beyond. I'm focusing specifically on the diaspora because I keep honing in that it's a $109 billion business. Even if it's not just the right thing to do, it's the thing that makes the most financial sense.
So these affinity groups are basically moving, how many thousands of travelers every year have a following?
Thousands of travelers every year on multiple trips all over the world, and they're doing it independently. And they're having the conversations with our organization in terms of when they reach out to destinations, they're not getting engagement, but they're just making it happen.
Got it. So Jeremy, at the Travel Foundation, you work more with, or you have at least in the past, with traditional tour operators. Any thoughts on what Naledi's just said and about these affinity groups? And in the last year, with everything changing so much, what are you seeing happening in terms of how we can, shake up this old school tourism chain?
Yeah, I was thinking a lot about supply chains and the challenge, particularly of leakage. So of money that does not stay in the community. And I think it's really interesting how much increased demand there is for all things local. One of the biggest challenges that I think we have in our industry is that there really aren't any standards for how local is defined. So for example, local could be defined using whatever geographic spread a company wants. It could be from right across the street, or it could be from just over the border. And local isn't always synonymous with diversity or genuinely kind of supportive of community needs. So I get pretty concerned about the potential for, let's call it local washing. You know, that's like slapping the local label on something kind of willy-nilly and not applying a DEI lens to that conversation to ensure that enough benefit is spreading to vulnerable or underserved communities.
That's right. And I mean, there's been a lot of diversifying in terms of the messaging. You know, especially in the US, we've seen, you know, destinations are, you know, now proud to show their diverse neighborhoods, and, you know, the consumer wants that too. But that's great, you know, that's really great effort, but that's really just skims the surface, doesn't it? I mean, what's being missed there in terms of really shaking up the chain?
I mean, if you think about diversity at all levels, there's the diversity around marketing, messaging, and the storytelling. So it's great that we're getting more diverse storytellers and stories, and the images that we're seeing, you know, are more reflective of the population. But then we need to really think about how diverse are our stakeholders and our decision makers. What do our boards look like? What do our executive councils look like? You know, last year, you know, coming out of the Black Lives Matters movement, you saw a lot of black squares, you know, in social media. And so where are we now a year later? Right. You know, has anything really changed? I've been asked to be on a lot of advisory boards. Advisory boards don't have any power. So, you know, what's the real change that's happening that's not just performative and window dressing?
Right. So speaking of real change happening, another issue really is tourism needs to become more community-minded. The industry's likely to face increased backlash. I mean, we already saw that before the pandemic, and communities are a lot more vocal. And travelers also want, you know, more authentic experiences. They want to support these local businesses. They want to see you supporting DEI initiatives. So I think, Jeremy, this one's for you. I mean, Hawaii Tourism CEO John DeFries at our Destination Summit in July was quite frank with the industry and said, you know, stop talking about communities like they're third parties. You know, they're not spectators. And so what does it mean that communities are no longer bystanders? And, you know, in your work at the Travel Foundation lately, are you seeing stakeholders coming forth and saying we want to do this differently? We want to, you know, share the tourism pie and measure our impact?
Yeah, you know, we are to some extent. I think there's progress has been made. I love that quote that he said. I think he said specifically, stop saying that we need to invite communities to the table. Communities are the table. To me, I think communities own the table. You know, and in some ways, I think if we're not ensuring that tourism benefits residents, local businesses, and visitors, if it doesn't benefit all three, how can we say that tourism really works? And I think in many cases, what's been missing is this idea that product can and should really be co-developed in the first place. You know, we need to draw on community creativity. We need to make sure that we're not adding unwanted costs or impacts on cultural and environmental resources that communities thrive on. So it seems to me like we need to push forward a new relationship between businesses and communities. Sometimes we call that approach destination stewardship, but maybe just to avoid that kind of jargon, I think it means genuinely arriving at a common agenda for what tourism looks like. So to illustrate how, yeah, go ahead.
So can you tell us about, you know, one of the recent examples of maybe the industry shifting and give us some good news?
Yeah, I have some great news. Hopefully this will illustrate, you know, our approach to building back better, which is a phrase that we heard so much over the last year. And we really thought as an organization, can we help define what better really looks like so that's not a platitude? So I'm really excited to have the opportunity to announce a partnership that we haven't talked about publicly yet. And so it's a bit of an exclusive here at Skift Global Forum. So we're announcing today a new partnership between the Travel Foundation and EasyJet Holidays, which is the newly launched tour operator business that sits underneath the EasyJet brand. And our partnership with EasyJet Holidays, we think will be different, certainly to anything we've ever done before. We think perhaps to something different than what anyone else has ever done before. So our partnership is going to be about destination stewardship. And the big vision is to establish a new kind of relationship between outbound tour operators and destinations. The aim is really to work together with the community to identify and develop a roadmap that addresses the material issues, so risks and opportunities related to tourism for 5 flagship destinations in the European Union, while offering some targeted engagement that will support destinations with the most pressing challenges that they have related to tourism and coming out of the pandemic. The focus is going to be on improving public-private collaboration, which I think is really key, not just talking about it, but really making it happen. And it won't be confined just to the impacts of EasyJet holiday operations, and I think this is what's pretty exciting. So the idea is to encourage broader collaboration among community groups, among public agencies, among other operators that maybe even be competitors, to really understand the material risk and opportunities that the community is identifying and amplify them. And I think it's critical that in making this happen, that community engagement is truly inclusive. This will be the single most important factor driving that roadmap that we'll produce in collaboration with local stakeholders. So I think putting the agenda of the community on top of everything else, and thinking where is investment needed, where is new product needed, how can we genuinely collaborate, but starting with the root issues that the local communities are identifying.
Oh, that sounds great. I mean, is that then a new model emerging of the way that tour operators link with destinations and sell travel? Potentially.
That's the goal. That's the goal, is to turn this into what we hope will be a global example. And I think we're going to learn a lot from the experience. So hopefully we can come back next year and have some really good outcomes and lessons learned to share.
Look forward to following that. I'm sure everybody in the audience is too. Touching on that whole, communities coming first, Naledi, Africa has really focused on regional collaboration over the past year, obviously, without international travel. And what you've once described as Africa for Africans is now sort of, in the spotlight. Do you see this growing and staying beyond the pandemic?
I think it will sustain itself because it has to. There's been talk before the pandemic about the need for collaboration amongst the destinations, but in earnest, it really only happened out of necessity. And so I think what happened is, now that destinations have started to tap into domestic and regional markets, they see the opportunity. And when you look at even, the Africa Free Trade Agreement and what that's going to do for business across the continent, you're seeing the opportunity. There's 1 billion people on the continent. Start there and start to tap into your own audience. There's a growing middle class. I believe by 2030, the majority of the continent is going to be under 30 or under 40. And so, you have a growing Pan-Africanism that's also growing across the continent, whereas 5 or 10 years ago, the lick was to go to the US, to Europe, to Dubai, and now more and more people want to go to Mozambique. They want to go check out Rwanda, and they want to explore the continent in ways that they haven't. And so the destinations, I think, are seeing the light, and so they will continue.
Okay, so the year 2023, I want to go on safari. Am I going to find that DMOs in Africa and the businesses are, still offering those great prices for Africans in the diaspora like myself, or is it going to be still the safari for rich white folks?
I think the pricing will remain. I don't know that it will be as easy to get. I think what will happen, it will probably be based on an inventory. What I've heard is a lot of models there'll be a reservation of special rates for residents and Africans across the continent. And I think that's going to remain, because I don't think this is going to be the last issue.
So let's get to climate action, which appears to be the topic of the moment. Jeremy, I want you to give us a really quick overview of Tourism Declares an Emergency, this initiative that kicked off just before the pandemic, but has really done some great work lately. And I also want you to talk to us quickly about the Glasgow Declaration and what that even means.
Sure. So Tourism Declares launched with 5 key commitments, and the goal was to get members of our sector to declare a climate emergency, to commit to climate action plans, to ground them in science, to collaborate with one another, and to advocate across the industry. And let's remember, January 2020, when Tourism Declares launched, hardly anyone was talking about climate action plans in tourism or the climate situation at all. So we have made that commitment as the Travel Foundation. There are signatories across the world, mostly front runner companies and some regional destinations. But beyond the signatories, I think they've done a good job of ensuring that those commitments have increasingly shaped our industry's response. And a ton of work has been done to support the industry, not only in accelerating planning, but addressing what I think is maybe the most important issue, which are the significant gaps that we have in capacity across our sector. Really understanding, well, what do we do about this? What is our role, and how do we address climate action from within from within travel and tourism, and gathering, I think, the emerging picture of the genuine impact that the climate emergency is already having on our industry, increasing costs, shifting seasons, and more concerned guests who are asking us increasingly, what are we doing about the situation? That's resulted in new methodologies, a global survey of climate action, which is providing us with the clearest picture yet, I think, of the need for more support, more education, and financing. So that led us to the Glasgow Declaration, which we had the opportunity as the Travel Foundation to draft alongside UNWTO, the UN Environment Programme, Tourism Declares, and Visit Scotland. We just announced the declaration yesterday. The declaration will be launched at the COP26 in November in Glasgow. What it does is it builds on these original commitments of Tourism Declares. So it brings climate action plans to the mainstream, and most importantly, it commits our sector and the signatories of the declaration to 5 pathways. Measure, decarbonize, regenerate, collaborate with one another, and finance.
So by next year, we're going to see climate action plans from a good chunk of the industry. Is that what you're saying?
Well, that's the requirement of being a signatory, is that there is a climate action plan that is transparent, aligned with those pathways, aligned with science, and demonstrates how travel and tourism will be significantly decarbonizing, aligned with the Paris Agreement, and being a part of the solution, coming up with regenerative actions that help create a just transition in destinations, working with each other and putting significant budget behind this. We're seeing engagement from key players. WTTC announced yesterday that they plan to stand firmly behind the declaration. So I think that's fantastic news for our industry in terms of
UNWTO and WTTC aligned on climate action. That's big news.
That's important news. Climate action isn't something we can compete on.
Yes, absolutely. I know, Naledi, is climate action even a possible, or likely topic right now for everything that the continent is going through in Africa?
In full transparency, look, climate action is a priority, right? And it's acknowledged, but our focus has been really on increasing our market share, capacity building for small and medium enterprises. Like, we have such a small market share and so many other issues. We've prioritized those issues, but we're at the point now where we have to equally prioritize climate change, because the importance of the tourism industry across the GDP on the continent is going to be impacted by climate change. And so we can't afford not to pay attention.
Right. So I want to just take this question because I think it's quite good. What do you make of the trend where local tour operators are bypassing outbound tour operators and agencies to reach the consumer directly? Are they able to meet the required international standards, or will they forever be at the end of the value chain? Jeremy, do you want to answer that?
I'm not sure. I think that travel and tourism is changing all the time. The routes to market are changing. Look at what's happened in the last several years with OTAs and the sort of concentration of power there. But the challenge there is that it has the tendency to dilute the message and dilute the offer. And so I think, I'm not sure. Really. Yeah.
Okay, so I know we're almost running out of time, but I really want to get to this. All of the issues that we've discussed today, climate action, diversifying the tourism chain, communities, it really all comes back to DEI, diversity at the leadership level. And I feel like, can we really sit here and talk about solutions when, the boardrooms of the majority of the world's, largest and most valuable public travel companies lack diversity in their boardrooms, and at the executive level, the decision making does not reflect today's traveler, does not reflect tomorrow's traveler. the multicultural, affinity groups that we've just talked about. Why is it so hard to bring new voices to the table, and is DEI now at the back of the discourse?
Well, one, I don't think it's hard. I think that that's just sort of a cop-out that's used. And I would challenge the CEOs and board members of multinational companies to really take a hard look at how they're addressing DEI, whether we're talking about accessibility, ethnicity, gender, whatever the case may be. I think that it's so hard is used as a way to sort of delay making any changes, and then when you look up a year later, nothing's actually been done, or it's just been these performative layers of activity. And so I think the key is to continue to sort of, keep the foot on the neck, keep sending emails, keep knocking on doors, keep crashing Skift conferences, that kind of thing.
Well, Jeremy, I know you said you love to be held accountable. So, as the CEO of a foundation that clearly interfaces with the tourism industry a great deal, I mean, how are you going to handle that? How are you going to shake up your boardroom?
Yeah. Well, to me, it's really interesting because I've been thinking about all of these issues and how they're linked. Climate, community, equity, they're 100% linked, and none of them can be achieved without the other. So to me, what we're really talking about is a whole new model of tourism consumption and production that will drive us forward. And this kind of model requires that we don't just look at this through our own limited perspectives, but ensure that everyone in the room, the room that I host, the room that that my extended room through the various coalitions that we're engaged with has an inclusivity perspective and a diversity one. We have work to do on our own board, that is very clear, but we've extended that perspective gathering through the Future of Tourism Coalition, where we have quite a diverse advisory board and a community of signatories that we're asking regularly for feedback, for ideas. I mean, it's meant to be a giant collaboration. Through the Glasgow Declaration, we also did pretty extensive consultation to make sure that that conversation was inclusive, and that we were talking to destinations who also are facing the other end of the stick. Let's face it, I mean, climate action is creating a need for significant adaptation in places, and we can't ignore that aspect and that voice of this conversation. So there's work to do. There's work to do in this room, and I think what we most of all need is genuine collaboration, but in various senses: a systems-based approach, infrastructure.
Absolutely.
Addressing impacts that we're collectively responsible for, and again, in order to get there, we need the variety of perspective at the table, or we won't address the root issues that we're talking about today.
And can I just quickly add, it has to happen in the rooms where we're not already there. Otherwise, there's no change, because they just keep talking to one another.
Right. Well, that's a great place to end. Thank you both so much for your insights. Lily. And to the audience, I encourage you to reach out to either Jeremy and Naledi well beyond the conference as well.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Yeah, thank you very much.